Let's look at 7-5A, where in this example we're going to be applying the activity-based costing, which is a better method of allocating overhead than a single rate allocation method. In this case, what we're doing is looking at the overhead, but the overhead is divided into various cost pools, and these are separated based on these costs being driven by different types of activity. For instance, in the overhead are copying costs or copier costs. And what you do is you take those dollars, those estimated overhead dollars, and allocate it using some activity or what would be called a cost driver. In other words, what drives these costs? What causes these costs? And then use that activity to allocate. Well, with copier costs, it makes sense to use number of pages copied, because the more you copy, the more costs you have in that overhead. For secretary's salary, you would want to use probably time spent by the secretary on each or for each department. Though this one's a tough one to allocate, because it may not be cost beneficial to have the secretary keep track of what time is spent for each department. So again, on all of this, you do your best. It's situational, depends on the cost benefit as well. The advising department costs, well, on that one, it makes a lot of sense to use the number of students. So it requires, though, knowing how many students are accounting students that you're advising versus the other majors, which isn't that hard to keep track of. The other thing is advertising costs, where you can spend a fair amount on that. On that one, it again, you'd have to look at what are you advertising? Is it benefiting all of the different disciplines? If so, maybe you would do number of classes for that allocation, because the more classes, maybe you could say, then the more the cost should be covered by that particular department. The other is to keep track of the number of ads by each department. In other words, like the secretary's time. Keep track of who's benefiting from these ads, so number of ads. But again, you'd have to be advertising separately. So again, overhead is being allocated based on different drivers. So it requires dividing up the total overhead into these different pools and then really looking closely at what causes those costs and allocate accordingly.